Okay, guys, welcome to another episode of Rotten Reviews. Today I'm going to look at the 1994 movie Timecop with Jean-Claude Van Damme. We have a tomato score of 45% rotten and a 36% audience score. Now, right off the bat, I'm going to say that I'm surprised to find the professional critics' tomato meter score at 45%. I was expecting something along the lines of 15%. Considering how harsh the critics are. But then again, there's no accounting for the critics. That's the one thing that I haven't been able to put a logic to in most cases. So let's move on to the audience score. I think the audience score is respectable. I think it's largely accurate. I think it could have been higher. I would put this at a 45%, almost a 50%, but not quite. I would still consider that this is rotten in the Rotten Tomatoes sense of the word. Overall, though, I enjoyed the film. I enjoyed it when it came out. Everybody I knew enjoyed it at the time. I still could watch it again and enjoy it. Now, we weren't expecting, of course, some kind of James Cameron blockbuster. We weren't expecting another Terminator 2. We were just flat out expecting an enjoyable Jean-Claude Van Damme action movie. That's what we got. You just don't think about it too hard. Don't think about the plot too deeply. Just, ease into it and enjoy. So overall, I enjoyed it. But let's take a look at how well it's aged. In particular, why it might deserve that 36% audience score now as of November of 2019. So right into the audience reviews. We start off with one from August 13th of this year, 2 stars. My brain hurts from trying to solve how this all works out. Some rules of time travel are followed, some aren't. How did the house survive in the end when it blew up twice? It hits just about every clique or cliche in the book. It's a movie that you should watch if it just so happens to be on TV late at night. I'll largely agree with that. Again, as I said, you can't look into the plot holes or try to find plot holes and expect to just find one or two. There's plenty of them. There are plenty that I've forgotten about. There are plenty that you should forget about because this movie is not trying to present the case for time travel all wrapped up in a neat bow with no issues. It's flat out accepting its issues. It doesn't make fun of itself. It takes itself 100% serious, and it's just expecting the audience to go along for a good ride. 3 stars. This is one of the better Van Damme films. No, I wouldn't say it's 3 stars. Personally, I think it deserves a 2-star just because it is not the best Van Damme movie. In this movie, we get a kind of a strange type of Jean-Claude Van Damme in which he's playing himself, but two just slightly different versions of himself. One that has kind of a mullet, a weird 90s version of a mullet, and another that's supposed to be a 10 years down the road Van Damme who's more clean cut and military in appearance. Again, he plays a cop that's attached to a federal outfit that is a bureau of time travel, so to speak. They're in charge of ensuring that time travel technology is not misused, and he's one of the cops that enforce the laws. He is sent back in time along with other of these time cops to police people trying to use the technology for personal gain and screw up the timeline, so to speak. You can't take this 100%, tight like you're looking at some kind of critical work on time travel theory. It's not. In fact, it kind of harkens Back to the Future. In Back to the Future, the DeLorean has to get up to 88 miles per hour for it to go back in time. It kind of does that a little bit in this movie. The time travelers are sent back by sitting in kind of a rocket chair sort of device or a rocket sled that has to get up to a certain speed by the time it hits the end of the track, and then they go back in time. It's kind of cheesy in the way that they're brought back. They're kind of just zapped back and they reappear in the rocket sled. That's in the reverse of what they did to go back in time. It's kind of not explained how their body reappears back in the rocket sled when they come back, to the future. it reminds me of Back to the Future and a little bit of the mechanic, less of the Terminator. People, of course, are going to compare this to the Terminator movies, especially T2, because this follows T2 by a couple of years. But this time travel is a little bit different. The effects aren't bad. The CGI wasn't bad. And again, it's not an over CGI'd movie. It's the CGI effects are just used in the actual time travel itself. Everything else in the movie is practical effects, standard action movie, gunfights, etc. Let's move on. 3.5 stars. Great sci-fi classic with amazing visuals and story. The acting is a little hokey, though. Yeah, the acting's a little hokey. In particular, Ron Silver plays a billionaire villain who is, the guy behind it all that's attempting to use time travel to take over the world, as it were. He plays himself as a kind of a mustache twirling villain. He even treats himself, his doppelganger in the movie, with disrespect. I think he does a good job, but his performance does kind of come a little bit hokey. You just have to sit back and enjoy this as a popcorn film. This isn't an Academy Award attempt or anything. 3 stars. What's not to like? Bear in mind this film is now 25 years old. Oldie but goodie. I'll agree with that. Not on the 3 stars, but this film is 25 years old. Don't expect the solution to time travel, and don't expect over-the-top CGI. This was just an action flick. It has about the same competence as any other Van Damme action flick. This one might have a little bit higher of a budget than the standard Van Damme flick of that day. But it's, for what it is, it's fine. 4 stars. Van Damme and time travel, sci-fi done well and not cheesy. No, I disagree on that. It is a little cheesy sometimes, but it's forgivably cheesy. It's not like offensive, making you angry type of cheesy. Again, if you saw this movie in the theater, you weren't upset or mad or walking out halfway through. The Rotten Tomatoes audience score might suggest that you would be, but no, you would be sitting in your seat till the very end. In fact, you probably left the theater completely satisfied, for what you paid for. So don't think that it's, offensive in any way or that bad. I saw this movie when it was first released on VHS, home video. I was completely satisfied by it, and I thought it was pretty cool. Like I said, everybody I knew at the time thought it was pretty cool. 2.5 stars. Another enjoyable effort from JCVD. This film is entertaining, and sci-fi fans will enjoy the mind-bending, if predictable, ride. It offers nothing new, but it is entertaining if you can turn your brain off for 90 minutes. I'll agree completely. They give it 2.5. I'll give it 2 stars. 2 stars. Van Damme's time travel film is no Terminator, but as far as Van Damme films go, it's pretty good, which isn't saying much. The action was okay, but the story wasn't very well done, and the effects were pretty bad. It's a shame Van Damme is an afterthought when it comes to action stars, but he does his best, even with a pretty poor script. Well, just as an aside, I think the reason why Van Damme, isn't a current thing and he kind of just faded away, I think a lot of Van Damme's mystique, even his action fighting, his style of martial arts, a lot of that is just the way it's filmed. In the real world, he's a very small guy. Yes, he was a very fit and very small guy, but, when you filmed him and you filmed it the right way, it worked perfectly as an action vehicle. He worked perfectly as an action vehicle star, but yet he never could transition to serious acting. And again, once you've seen him in 3 or 4 movies, you've kind of seen everything there is about him. There's nothing new. He didn't go on to become known for anything else. And so other than his even largely forgettable role in the newest Expendables films, he's an afterthought. But again, I don't find him bad or off-putting. I just think that he's a product of the 90s, and, the 90s have gone away. 1.5 stars. Timecop seems to forget the rules they set in place for time travelers that are established in the beginning of the film by allowing Van Damme to leave behind a copy of a 2004 edition of U.S. a today in 1929, and mass destruction of a building. Not to mention the leaving behind of dead bodies, time traveled into the past, pure sci-fi garbage. Yeah, it's asking you not to think about this too much. It is saying they are sending time cops back into the past to keep people from screwing around with the past. But at the same time, they're doing plenty of screwing around with it, and they're just forgetting about things and leaving them behind. At the pace this movie moves, when you first saw it, or when I first saw it, these things flew right by because you're just caught up in the premise and the action, and so you forget about all these plot holes. Again, if you go into this looking for plot holes, that's all you'll see. But if you just enjoy it for an action film, by the time you think about these plot holes, the film's already over and you've already enjoyed yourself. And that's basically what kind of movie this was. 3 stars, not bad, semi-serious sci-fi film for a Van Damme movie in a popular then time travel theme. Yeah, time travel was popular then, not just because of the Terminator films, but because you were seeing more budget put into films that explored time travel and different angles on time travel. You saw that in the TV shows of the time in the 90s as well. Some things worked and some things different. I don't think time travel's played out yet. I think that it has yet to reach the point where we're sick of time travel movies. So we're going to see a lot more, and I think this is just, this was as Hollywood started to put money into time travel movies. After Terminator 2 and others, everybody wanted to jump on the bandwagon and say, hey, time travel movie can have, a $30 million budget, etc. And so the budget started increasing. Again, this movie shouldn't be even considered largely as a time travel movie. It should actually be considered more of as just a 90s Van Damme action flick, secondarily as a time travel movie. If you were to construct a list of actually good time travel movies, this really wouldn't make the cut, only in the sense that it belongs in the genre, but this would actually make the cut for a passable 90s action movie. 4 stars. I disagree on the 4 stars, but anyway, one of those sci-fi movies that's more enjoyable the less you analyze it. It's silly and it knows it, and thankfully doesn't try to over-explain anything. There are some great fight scenes, an interesting story, a good villain, and hilarious one-liners. If you're a fan of over-the-top action movies, look no further than Timecop. I would agree again, except I think 4 stars is a little bit too generous. 4 stars again. I can't believe I never saw this when I was a teenager, or somehow forgot it if I had, but Jean-Claude Van Damme's action or Time Cop was a ton of fun. Strangely, for a Van Damme flick, it's actually kind of smart. It plays with the idea of time travel and event manipulation very well. It's sort of a kick-ass action version of the butterfly effect, and I enjoyed it. Again, I'll largely agree with that. This precedes the butterfly effect by quite a number of years, and I wouldn't consider it in the same genre even. And I would disagree with 4 stars, but overall I agree in the sense that even if you saw this in the movie theater, you came away from this movie feeling good about it. Half a star, Spanish. 1.5 stars. I wish I could go back in time and tell my past self to skip it. Okay, but again, I think you're trying to view this with a 2019, or in this case, a 2016 critical eye. It wasn't designed for that. 2 stars. Yes, it's stupid, but even worse, it's that it's boring. No, I disagree, it's boring. It kind of had a little love story in there. It didn't slow down the pace of the movie. I didn't feel it did, so I disagree that it was boring. 3 stars. Jean-Claude Van Damme honestly was a horrible decision to have him portray the movie's protagonist Walker. Set in the year 2004, the plot to Time Cop is time travel has just been invented, and many people have realized how easily it is to cause the end of the world, knowing this is a company was created for law enforcement to stop time travelers from causing the end of the world. Okay, it's a summary, not a very good summary. Again, the movie openings in a Civil War era scene in which, something that could have taken place during the Civil War, a gold shipment for the Union is hijacked by somebody, from the Confederacy. Then somebody turns out to be from the future and pulls a couple of Uzis out with laser sights and blows the Union soldier away, and the gold is stolen. That's kind of cool. That was a cool premise, a cool opening. But it's kind of the whole concept of time travel and what it could be abused for that actually hooks you into the movie. And the rest of the movie is just an action film that's passable. 3.5 stars. One of Jean-Claude Van Damme's better films. The action and premise hold up as you try to piece together the lapse of the layered universes. Yeah, it also kind of tries to skirt the edge of playing around with the multiverse idea, but doesn't quite go there. The idea is to just get not only the hero of the movie to kind of face himself or try to avoid facing himself, but the villain of the movie actually has to face himself and converse with himself in the past, and that's kind of interesting. I haven't seen that done a lot in time travel movies. 2.5 stars. This is probably Van Damme's best movie. Though that's not saying much. It's the most commercial and doesn't feel cheap like his other movies. It's still cheesy and all that, but it's the 90s and Van Damme. You should expect that. I largely agree with this. This does feel like Van Damme's best movie because I think this has the most budget to it, and his character is actually expected to do something more than action. He's supposed to be somebody that's changed after 10 years. He's supposed to be somebody that's got a love interest or a lost love interest aspect going on to his character arc. So it does feel like he's got more to do. He's more real. The budget's higher. But again, I wouldn't say it's his best movie because, if you're going to make a list of the best Van Damme movies, you have to go back to the ones where he's just a straight up brawler, like, for example, Bloodsport. Or personally, I might go back and revisit the very first movie I saw him appear in as a bad guy, which was the movie. I can't think of the name of it off the top of my head. It's about the kid that meets he's trained by the ghost of Bruce Lee, and Jean-Claude Van Damme shows up as this like Russian fighter that's the bad guy. In any case, if I think about it, I'll add it on the description. Jean-Claude Van Damme showed up as just the role of an evil Russian kickboxer in that movie. Now, I think that Jean-Claude Van Damme's most popular movie is probably still Bloodsport. That was the over-the-top movie he broke out into prominence for. So yeah, I'd say Bloodsport. Even though it's a cheesy movie, it's what Jean-Claude Van Damme was known for. So I wouldn't say this is his best film. I just think this is the film where they gave him the most plausible character arc stuff to do. He was supposed to be taken seriously. Again, this movie doesn't attempt to poke fun of itself. It's not a comedy in any way. It does have some one-liners. It does have some witty dialogue between some characters, but it's not expected to be a comedy in any way. 5 stars. One of the best movies in my opinion. I would say no, and if you do think that, I need you to give us a little bit more as to why you think that. 1.5 stars. I have to steal a quote from Richard Harrington of the Washington Post. For once, Van Damme's accent is easier to understand than the plot. Yeah, you kind of wonder if that's a bad thing or a good thing. Again, if you go back to Van Damme's earliest roles, his accent is forgivable because he's just an action kickboxer. When he tried to do more serious things, that's when you have to go into more backstory in the movie on explaining why he has this accent. In particular, I would bring up Universal Soldier because they actually put, a backstory to his character that he came from New Orleans to explain how he could have this French accent. That's maybe also part of the reason that Van Damme faded away. You'll notice that, for example, if I bring up Arnold Schwarzenegger, go back and watch Arnold Schwarzenegger's first things, like in Blazing Saddles, particularly watch Hercules in New York. He has very little speaking because his accent is really bad. He's still speaking Austrian German. And he actually put the effort, we're not saying it's perfect, but Arnold actually improved his acting and got coached and practiced his English, whereas Van Damme, I don't think he could quite overcome the French part of himself enough to become greater, in other roles. That's just my opinion. 4 stars. Way more entertaining than just a mindless martial arts movie. I personally think that the critics way underrated this Jean-Claude Van Damme movie. It had all the things that one would want to see in and expect in one of his movies, with a plot that was way more entertaining than just a mindless martial arts movie. Analytically, things in the plot might be considered to be a paradox, but that in itself is an added bit of spice to the entertainment. Yeah, I kind of agree with him. um, he is giving more to do in this movie character-wise than just beating people up. I don't know, it's a matter of opinion whether it succeeds or fails. I thought it mostly did for what it was trying to do. Again, I agree, because most of his movies, they don't try to put that much depth into his character at all. 4 stars. Effects look a little dated, but the premise is interesting. Yeah, I'll agree. Again, I don't agree on 4 stars. 2.5 stars. In a world where time travel to the past is possible, Jean-Claude Van Damme plays a cop whose job it is to make sure bad guys like Ron Silver's politician don't use it for ill-gotten gains. Cheesy, but has some fun moments. The Smithereens great cover of Time Won't Let Me plays over the credits. 2.5 stars. I could follow that. 2 stars. To be honest, this film felt like a lifetime when it is just an hour and 40 minutes. The plot isn't moving, and I didn't care for or feel for any of the characters in this cheesy sci-fi action flick. With that being said, some of the action is good in this film, and I did like the time travel aspect. Overall, Timecop is a boring sci-fi film that is deservedly overlooked by better sci-fi movies of The Terminator and The Matrix. Yeah, but again, I disagree that you can compare this to The Terminator. Okay, maybe you can compare it to the first Terminator, and comparing it to The Matrix is a no-go for me. It's not the same genre. There's nothing about time travel in The Matrix, and certainly The Matrix is from a totally different time period. It's from the late 90s, so no, I don't agree. Terminator maybe, but comparing it to The Matrix, completely apples and oranges, not fair. 2.5 stars. It's an okay film, a tad cheesy in parts, but what do you expect from a JCVD movie? Not as good as when I first watched it, but then my tastes have changed. The idea of time travel interests me, and if it were possible, you just know someone would use it for their own gains. Well, that's, bringing up something in the movie. They kind of showed you what other people were using the time travel for. There were, a whole bunch of nefarious people out there that had the money to cobble together time machines, and they were exploiting it. Some of them were sending people back to the 1920s to exploit stock market moves. Some people were trying to rescue the Iranian hostages, in 1979, 80 Iran, things like that, that they sound goofy, but actually, if time travel were something that had spread to different private interests, if everybody had figured out the secret, yeah, you would see this kind of stuff. It would be a mess. The one implausible part I have of the movie is that just some time bureau, some commission set up by the U.S. Senate from the federal government could somehow keep this from all spiraling out of control. I disagree. I think that in the real world, if everybody figured out time travel and it started to pop up all over the place, we would this world would be ended so fast we wouldn't even know it happened. But in this movie, supposedly, a secret organization of the federal government with a limited budget can somehow, keep all this from spiraling out of control. That's the part I found really far-fetched. It was an interesting premise, but that's the most far-fetched part to me, beyond even the time travel. 3.5 stars. Directed by Peter Hyams, Capricorn 1, Outland, and The Star Chamber. Well, see, that's interesting. I didn't know that. This was directed by the same person that did Capricorn 1. Capricorn 1, I think, is a fantastic movie. That might be something for Rotten Reviews, depending. They're again comparing this to the Terminator films, and they're doing a plot summary. They say 3.5 stars. I think that's too high. Again, I wish they'd stop comparing things to the Terminator films, just because, if it has a robot, or if it has time travel, or it has cybernetic stuff, immediately people want to leap to comparing it to the Terminator movies. And that just shows you, I guess, the cultural impact of the Terminator, although it's a dead franchise pretty much. 2.5 stars. Back to the Future type vehicle for time travel. Again, I mentioned that. Inane dialogue, plot more difficult to understand than Van Damme's accent. Actually, no, the plot was pretty simple. It was a simple one time loop paradox type problem they were trying to solve. So I don't agree with that one. 3 stars. Time Cop is actually not half bad. It's super dated by now, but it's still mildly entertaining as long as you understand what you're getting yourself into. Max Walker is a time cop, part of the Time Enforcement Commission. He stops crimes that happen when people time travel to the past to benefit because of future knowledge or technology. The crazy thing is they never explain how people know how to time travel. They sort of just assume you can roll with it. Okay, that's a valid criticism, but it's a plot hole, I suppose. It could be a failure of backstory. It could be a failure of backstory because again, you're just told that time travel technology has spread, to the larger world. People know how to do this with enough money, but they don't explain exactly how they figured this out or who invented it. That's just a backstory thing more than a plot hole. 4 stars, original JCVD, awesome if a little predictable. Awesome maybe, but I wouldn't say it's awesome. 5 stars, a great sci-fi action flick starring Mr. Van Damme. This is one of my favorite flicks of his, up there with Bloodsport, Lionheart, and Hard Target. This is a very fun film and it's never boring. The fight scenes rock and it's great entertainment. I recommend it to all action fans. Okay, if you're a Jean-Claude Van Damme action fan, yeah, you'll like it. But again, 5 stars? No, 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 it's not quite there. 3.5 stars, Jean-Claude Van Damme's biggest Hollywood film, shows that he may have been able to reach Arnold or Sly levels of fame if he hadn't thrown it down the drain with drugs. The film was directed by A-list director Peter Hyams, who I always was impressed that he doubled as his own cinematographer. Okay, they're saying that maybe Jean-Claude Van Damme's career went down because of drugs. I don't know about that, but still it's irrelevant to the movie. I don't agree. 3.5 stars. I say 2 stars. 2 stars. It's a mess, but it's still entertaining. I agree. We have 4.5 stars. This is a great movie. JCVD does a good job with the script, and the idea is very interesting since we have so many movies about time travel. This is one that shows that if time travel was real, we would need a police force, so it's a good idea. Also, I found I really cared about the characters. I wanted to see Walker save his wife. This movie is no Citizen Kane, but then again, it isn't supposed to be. I'll 100% agree with this, except the stars. I think that the story about him having the chance to go back and save his wife, the love angle to the story, I thought that was great. It did have emotion to it. And again, if you're not expecting an Academy Award winner, this movie leaves you perfectly satisfied. 3 stars. Van Damme plays Max Walker, a time cop. Okay. Let's see. Through corruption in his own agency and government, he is tasked with quite a chore. Time Cop may not be a masterpiece, but it is an enjoyable action film with time travel and features some pretty cool deaths. It's disappointing that more time periods were not used, but overall it's a solid enough movie. Yeah, that was kind of a little bit disappointing to me too, even though I enjoyed the movie at the time. They did show you one glimpse of, Civil War time, and the rest of the movie took place within 10 years of its anchor point in time, so to speak. So yeah, I think that was a budgetary limitation. There was one small scene largely in an office in the 1920s, but yeah, it didn't jump all over the place. If you're expecting a time travel movie that jumps all over the place and shows you different sets and times, you're not really going to get that with this movie. The bulk of the action takes place in modern times and 10 years forward of that. So yeah, that'll disappoint people if they're looking for that. 5 stars, one of Van Damme's best movies. Yeah, it's one of his best movies, but it's not 5 stars, and I'll leave it at that. I don't know if I can convince anybody that this is better than, the 36% audience score. I think the audience score deserves close to a 50%. The tomato meter's fine. In fact, I'm surprised it's not lower the way the critics are. But overall, Time Cop is a completely enjoyable movie. I would recommend seeing it at least once, even in 2019. Even if only for historical purposes. So I'll see everybody on the next Rotten Reviews.